Good morning.
Morning.
Glad everybody could be out here this morning. It's good to be back. It's kind of strange to even look on your faces there. See you. Sorry I've been away so long, but the title of my sermon this morning is from that scripture that Mike read to us. You want me to do what to my enemies? Now just think about that for a moment. God says what he means. We have to believe what he says. But some of the things he assigns to us is maybe harder than others. I struggle with this. I really do. I always blame it on my poor mother, but my mother, she could hold a grudge forever. I mean, she just had trouble forgiving, really trouble forgiving, and I inherited that from her, and I've even expounded on it too. So, Jesus said we should love our enemies, but I don't even like them. Why should I love them? I don't want to show them love because they are my enemies. So, put two and two together. If they're my enemies, I don't want to love them. How many here have had a problem with somebody, maybe even a relative or a former friend? I don't want you to raise a hand, that's okay. Or maybe even a church member. And I'm here to say this morning that I'm old. I'll be 70 on December 1st. And I have had problems with probably all three of those people. And if you live long enough on this earth, you will probably have trouble with maybe one category, maybe two, maybe all three. But the idea is, God is telling us that we have to work on that. We have to work on loving our enemies. I found this little saying, and I always like little sayings. There once were two cats from Kilkenny. Each thought there was one cat too many. They fought and they spit and they clawed and they bit, till instead of two cats, there weren't any. They were so angry at each other, they killed each other. And that's happened before too, let's face it, on this earth, that's happened before too. People have done that. Now that strikes me as funny because we can picture cats doing that. However, we heard the story of those cats, and if you've heard cats fight, my little black cat likes to pick on the female cat. The black cat's male and female, and every now and then, in the middle of the night, I'll get woke up and he's ripping into her and she's ripping into him, and they're in the hallway fighting. So you hear that. You can hear that. You can hear them in the backyard in an alley. In fact, cats are so well known for this that when two women get in a fight, what do they call it? They call it a cat fight. Cats are cats, and cats act like cats. But Christians, would we behave like that? Would we? Well, yeah, we would. I had an incident that happened to me that I didn't even know the guy even had a problem with me, but I was at a car show one night when I still had my 65 Nova. I was sitting, me and Angie were sitting in front of the car, or it might have been me and Jason, I forget which child was with me, they might have both been there, but we were sitting in front of the car, and here comes this church member and his son that I didn't think I had a problem with him at all, you know what I mean? He comes walking up the aisle, same aisle that my car's parked in. 3 cars before he gets to me, him and his son cut across the aisle. Then they go down that aisle until they're 3 cars past me, and then they cut back over and go down. Just to avoid talking to me. Now I know you guys do that too. You want to hide somewhere and stuff like that and fall asleep just to avoid talking to me, right? But the idea is people get things in their mind and they do that to people, and that should never happen with Christians. Now, the thing that I'm ashamed of is I didn't approach him right then and take care of the problem. I didn't do that. Now later on, we kind of ironed it out, okay, but he was one of these kind of guys that just was not lovable. He passed away now, but he just was not, you weren't able to love him is what I'm trying to say. Just wouldn't open the door. So, and then also there's a church in Ohio here that was called the Bethlehem Church of Christ. Their building was built back around 1840. In their history book from the time of the Civil War, you could read this. We had fighting right here at home. The Democrats and Republicans were so bitter against one another, it broke the church up. Now, how many of us here knew churches that have split over things that people got into a dispute over? On the same page in that booklet, we're told of a fist fight that took place on church property. Two of our best men fought to a finish. One wanted to know if the other had enough. He said he had, so he let him up. Now just think about that. We go out in the parking lot, have a fist fight with a 6-story, I think it's 6 stories, that apartment building over there, with everybody looking out the window and saying, boy, I'd love to go to that church. Them two fools are out there beating each other to death. But see, sometimes we don't think about that we represent Christ. We represent Christ's church in everything that we do. And we have to be very careful. That came from the Restoration Herald is where it came from. But we have to make sure that we're doing that. And unlike those two cats from Kilkenny or the story about the car show, that's not nearly as funny. The cat's a little bit funny because they're hurting each other, but they're animals. You know what I mean? We humans are above that, right? So we should make sure that we're representing it differently, is what I'm trying to say. And Jesus knew Jesus knew what was going to happen with us, because he was tempted in the same way as we are. He knew it was going to happen, but he left direct instructions from our text this morning. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. I wish that wasn't in there. How about you? Because sometimes it's really hard to do. It really is. Now, why would Jesus have to tell us that? Well, there's a couple reasons that I can think of. First, Jesus didn't save us because we're nice people. Jesus saved us because we're sinners. And that verse right there tells us that we're sinning if we don't directly read that and take it to heart. As Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That means you were a sinner when Jesus saved you. And so was I. And when we became Christians, God called us to leave our sinful lifestyle that Paul described this way in Titus 3:3. For we ourselves were also once foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. The problem is that when Christians misbehave, they're just doing that what they've learned and not looking to God and Jesus who saved them. It's kind of a flashback moment sometimes. We just fall back into our old self and we get into an argument with somebody. Now that doesn't make it right. It just explains why it happens. And secondly, Jesus commands us to love our enemies because that kind of thing doesn't come naturally to us. In fact, Jesus' command doesn't even seem to make any sense. Did you notice who Jesus commanded us to love? Our enemies. The people that we really don't want to love. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Now, why on earth would I want to love my enemies? There's a reason they're my enemies, right? I don't like them. I mean, if I liked them, they wouldn't be my enemy. But we have to love everyone, no matter what. So inherently, Jesus' command seems illogical. It seems irrational. It doesn't make sense to us as humans. And people struggle with it because it doesn't seem normal. Why would Jesus tell us to love people who are enemies? Well, first, because that's what our God does. Jesus said in Luke 6:35 through 36, which was part of our text reading this morning, "But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful with us." In other words, when we love our enemies, we show the world that our Father is like God. What our Father is like. I'm sorry, I read too far ahead. God loves his enemies. And that's a good thing, because you and I were once his enemy. And how were we his enemy? We were sinners. We were not saved by Christ's blood. In Colossians 1:21 through 22, "And you who were once alienated and enemies in your own mind by wicked works, yet now he has reconciled in the body of his flesh through death, to present you holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight." Ephesians says pretty much the same thing. It says that we had been sinful, and our nature as children is of wrath. Now that truth leads us to another reason why we should love our enemies. When God loved us, he had something in mind. He had an end game. God's love for us resulted in him doing something for us. What was the result of God's love for us? Remember, before we became a Christian, before we were baptized into Christ, we were his enemy. Well, Colossians says his loving us led to us being reconciled. His love for us, remember again, we're his enemy. His love for us led to being saved. God loved us and others who were his enemy. So he decided to save them. That was his end game. His end game was that, but also there was another part of that end game. He wants us to become children of his, and God tells us that he wants us to love our enemies. It's God's love for us that led us to salvation. And what do you think his objective is in having us love our enemies? Of course, he wants us to work to bring our enemies to him. And that should be our ultimate goal. God has saved us, and now he has enlisted us to love the unlovable so they might be reconciled, so that our enemies might be saved. In essence, God trusts you and me. He believes in you and I, and so he has enlisted you to be his missionary to the lost. Sometimes we don't sit back and wonder about speaking to someone about the gospel because we may be afraid of getting rejected or whatever, but we may be the only chance they have of salvation. Do you realize that? We may be the only chance that they have of salvation. I read an article that compared the cost of killing an enemy on the battlefield to the cost of saving them by sending a missionary overseas. They noted that the average price to kill one enemy soldier in World War II was $200,000. Now, more recently with the Vietnam War and the other struggles that we've had, the average price to take a single life in Vietnam was $500,000. By contrast, the average cost to save a soul overseas was only $654 per person. Quite a contrast. And that's a pretty good bargain, really, don't you think? Because how much better would it be if we converted our nations to Christianity rather than shooting them in heat of battle? We are God's chosen people to take his word to the unsaved. But if you're God's missionary here in your family, your neighborhood, or on the job, or whatever, or wherever, the cost to you doing that is zip, nada. It's actually free. It's just speaking to someone and letting them know that they need to be saved and giving them the gospel. Now I want to put you on the spot a little bit. How many of you can think of such an enemy? Let me ask the question again in case you were sleeping. Are you awake? Okay. How many of you can think of such an enemy? Give me a show of hands. Does anybody in here have enemies? Every hand should go up. Well, can you see the genius of God in this? It costs nothing for you to be His missionary to those you don't like. But well, that's not really true though, because what could it cost you for opening your mouth about the gospel? I have three things that usually happen. I know all about that. I have the rolling of the eyes, or I have the turning around and stomping away in anger. Those are the three that I've occurred, and I've probably occurred maybe more than that, but I'm old and I can't remember. But the idea is, we do have a cost. There's a cost to us but should we really count that as any kind of a cost? No, because the soul is way more important. We may get insulted or maybe even hurt by these folks. That's the cost of being a missionary for God. But how do I do good, or how do I go about doing this love for my enemy thing? How can I do that? How can I change myself into someone that loves my enemy? How could I possibly show them love when I don't even like them? Well, Jesus gives us an insight on His battle plan right here in this passage. He tells us in Luke 6:31, "And just as you want men to do to you, you also do to them." Do you know what that's called? It's actually called the golden rule. That's usually what people call that. And all kinds of people realize the power of that advice from Jesus. In fact, there's a lot of folks who think that Jesus didn't even come up with that proverb on His own. They think He borrowed it from wise men in the past that were born way before He even came to earth. I remember seeing a sign one time. It was a poster in a doctor's office, I think it was, and it said that it was the golden rule. And it says, the wise sayings of those who lived. And it just goes down through and gives the reason. Well, Confucius was on that sign, and it said, and he was some 500 years before Jesus, and it says, "Do not unto others that you would not wish done to yourself." The Buddhists say, putting oneself in place of others, kill not nor cause to kill. The Hinduism, do not unto others which could cause you pain if done to you. Well, there you have it. Solid proof that others said it the same way Jesus did, hundreds of years before Him. Or is it? Really, if you read what they say, really what they're saying is, leave the people alone. Don't disturb them. And then that way they can't hurt you. But what our golden rule says is, step up, talk about it, and you sometimes have to pay the consequences. But there's one more thing that we need to know about this golden rule. It just isn't great advice from Jesus on how we should live our lives. It's our battle cry. This golden rule was intended by God to be our battle plan on how we could love our enemies and be good to them. I found another saying. It says, "Do unto others who don't like you as you would have them do unto you. But you know they won't. Do this before they can do the devious deed to you, and that they would do if given the chance. Shame them with goodness, kill them with kindness, and cut their throats with courtesy." Pretty awful saying, I think. In other words, do what they would not do to you. Why? Because that's the last thing that people expect. When someone's starting an argument with you, and you turn around and be kind to that person, it just kind of throws them off their game, doesn't it? because they can't believe that you just did it. Let me tell you a story about, years ago there was a new preacher in a church that came in, and one of the preachers was still a member there. In fact, he was an elder there. His name was Harry, but he was a very angry man. And when Harry retired to church, the church hired the next man for a larger salary than he had. That embittered him. And then the next guy that came along, they hired him for more money that they was paying Harry. But they bought Harry a car when he retired. But he still was bitter about them paying the additional money. And then they made the biggest mistake of all. They made Harry an elder, which they never should have done. Because Harry's attitude was that if he didn't get his way in a business meeting, he'd stomp out and leave. And that's not how an elder should be. With that kind of temperament, it was only a matter of time before Harry would blow up on the new preacher. Sure enough, one Sunday after church, he blew up after something that the new preacher had announced. Unfortunately for him, the leadership was meeting the next night to re-up their elders. They had some kind of a belief that the elders would be rotated in and out every 3 years, so they re-voted for him. And Harry lost his eldership. Well, then Harry blamed the new preacher for that, so he wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he left the church for 2 months, and then he came back with a bunch of his friends, and he let them know that the new preacher wasn't going to run him out of church. So the new preacher was standing on the stage getting prepared for everything to get going, and he seen his entourage come in, and they sat about halfway up and started setting in the aisle. Well, he headed down the aisle towards them. Well, they moved all the way over to the end of the pew. Well, he just followed them right over there. And he thought to himself, look, if you guys are going to do this, I'll follow you all the way out to the parking lot if I have to. And he walked up to Harry, and he reached his hand out. Well, to Harry's good account, he went ahead and shook his hand. Now, that's what we have to do. That's what I should have done at the car show. I should have just went over there and said, hey, what's your problem with me? And shook his hand and, tried to make up and see what was going on. But the idea is sometimes we just don't think about doing those things. I hate to admit it, but like I said, I was wrong about that situation that I was in. But the main point here is that Jesus has asked us to love our enemies so that we can bring them to Christ. I found this story years ago about a family that learned this truth. They had been doing their morning devotional and had just read Romans 12:20, where it says at the very beginning of that verse, therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. Their sons were 7 and 10 years old, were especially puzzled. Why should we feed our enemies? They wondered. Their parents wondered too, but the only answer the husband could give to the boys was, we're supposed to because God says so. A few days later, they learned why God said so. It seemed that for several weeks, their 10-year-old John Jr. would come home from school complaining about a classmate in his class that would poke him when the teacher was not looking. And this went on and on and on. Until finally the mother was ready to go down to the school and jab Bob himself, the boy. She said she remembered thinking, obviously the boy was a brat. Besides, why wasn't Miss Smith, the teacher, doing her job with her kids? I better give her a jab while I'm there too. She was still fuming when her 7-year-old son said, maybe he should feed his enemy. At that point, everybody looked at the dad. Since he was the head of the family, he should come up with a solution. But the only answer he could offer was the same one he had given before. I guess we should do it because God says so. So the mother sighed and turned to John Jr. and asked, well, do you know what Bob likes to eat? If you're going to feed him, you may as well give him something he likes. And the boy almost shouted, jelly beans. Bob just loves jelly beans. So they bought a bag of jelly beans for him to take to school the next day and decided that the next time Bob jabbed him, John Jr. was simply to turn around and deposit the bag of jelly beans on his enemy's desk. And then see what would happen if this thing that God said about feeding your enemies, if it would work. The afternoon, the boys rushed home from school. Getting off the bus, John Jr. called ahead, "It worked, Mom, it worked." And their mom asked, "What did Bob do? What did he say?" He was so surprised he didn't say anything. He just took the jelly beans, but he didn't jab me the rest of the day. In time, John Jr. and Bob became best of friends, all because of a little bag of jelly beans. The mom shared in the article that eventually both of the boys grew up and became missionaries on foreign fields, and any time they had trouble with friendship with people, they would invite them over to their house for dinner. And maybe that's why God said to feed our enemies. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High. One last thought. The way God showed love to us it's found in verse 16 of John 3. It tells us, "For God so loved the world that he gave." Loving our enemies involves giving. And I want to give you an assignment for this week. You remember the enemy you realized you had when you raised your hand, or thought about it when I said raise your hand? I want you to pray for the opportunity to show that person love this week. Your assignment is to find a way to give them something that they'd appreciate. I'd even give you an idea of something you could do. Since Romans says to feed your enemy, find out which restaurant they like to go to and buy them a gift card. But you can't effectively love your enemies unless we give our lives to Jesus. If you have a need this morning, you have the opportunity this morning to come to Christ and try to make those changes. If you need to come and be baptized, we can do that for you. Or if you just need to come back to Christ and you need prayers, we can pray about that for you. Please come as we stand and sing.